I'm going to record in Zoom as well, just for fun, as a precaution. All right, everybody. Well, thank you for joining us here today in this informal chat. I think most of you know who I am. My name is Vince Kotchian, founder of Vince Kotchian Test Prep. With me today is Blake Jensen, who is our kind of my right-hand man in terms of the SAT and the ACT. He's our lead tutor in that regard, and he'll give us kind of some color commentary on some of this stuff since he's already worked with the international student on the digital SAT, and he's more kind of in touch with the tutoring of it. I don't personally tutor SAT anymore. I just do GRE prep, but our company, of course, still does SAT and ACT. So the point of today, hopefully, is going to be to learn about what the digital SAT is, how we have to kind of deal with it differently than the SAT, both in terms of the test format, the way you take the test to kind of get students ready for that, and just to see if there's anything different we have to know about the scoring and score reporting, accommodations. And then we'll finish up by kind of talking a little bit about test prep itself, just to give you our 2 cents on that, and the tips that we learned for students based on how the March SAT went for the international students. So a few bumps in that process just because it's a new technology and a new way of taking it, but just to prepare students for a couple potential problems. So let me share my screen here just to show you a little visual or two. And we'll look at some slides first of all, and I'll just kind of run through some fun facts about the test. If you have a question, you can either raise your hand or save it to the end, or you can actually just speak up. It's not going to really throw me off or anything. This is not astrophysics. So digital SAT. The basic premise of what we're going to do is we're going to first talk about format and changes. We'll go into some scoring and score reporting just to see if anything has changed there. And then in terms of super scoring, we'll talk about the test administration, what it's going to be like for students who actually have to take the test, how accommodations work, if anything has changed there. And then, like I said before, test prep and kind of what we learned. So this won't take too long. So first of all, I think you guys by now probably know when the digital SAT is coming, but if you haven't kept up with that, the PSAT this year in October is going to be the digital PSAT. The format is going to be identical to the SAT in terms of everything except the scoring. So the number of questions, I believe, will be the same. The scoring will be the same as the current PSAT scoring. So it'll be out of 15, 20, right? And then the digital SAT for American students will be starting in March. And there's no going back. As soon as the digital SAT kind of comes onto the field, no more paper SAT unless you need a paper SAT if you have some kind of accommodations that require it. The international students who I talked about before, they just took the digital SAT for the first time in March. So they debuted it internationally first for whatever reason. So timing. Just to give you some kind of fun facts about the test format. And, these are just some interesting things, I think. The test is now, of course, online. That's why they call it the digital SAT. So it's on the College Board app. This is an app called Blue Book. So students need to kind of download that app. Oh, we got Patricia here. Students need to download that app, the Blue Book app, onto their device. By device, we typically mean a laptop, though you can take the test on an iPad as well. I don't think you can really take it on a phone. But anyway, you're going to download that, and it's going to be online at your school, just taken on your device. So kind of interesting that it's BYO device as opposed to, taking it on a school computer. So I think the big change about the test is it's shorter. It's only a 2 hours and 15 minutes, something like that. So way easier to get through, a lot more palatable to kind of sell to students, right? It's like, hey, it's only a 2-hour test. I mean, come on, might as well take it. It's not like this 4-hour paper affair that we were used to in the past. So the way that the test works is it always starts with the 2 verbal sections or modules, as they call them, and they're reading and writing. Very, very similar to today's SAT, but with some different question types. The big difference is that the reading passages are now kind of mini passages. They're only about 100 words. So you're not going to have any more long reading passages to get through. The types of reading questions are also a little bit different. We've actually noticed they're quite a bit more reasoning-based questions as opposed to just reading comprehension. So things like getting the function of a sentence, determining what strengthens a claim or weakens a claim, and some other different question types too. But a lot of the skills are also the same. All the grammar, all the punctuation, all those types of questions, the same exactly pretty much as the current test. The math modules, also pretty similar. The big difference is now you have, it's online and you can use an online calculator that's built into the app called Desmos. And the calculator is actually really useful compared to like a handheld calculator. So students will want to get used to that, of course, as they're practicing. So just to give you a few more facts about the sections, verbal sections, 27 questions, 32 minutes per section, and then math, you have 22 questions, 35 minutes. Again, you can use that calculator for the entire test. Unlike the current SAT where you have like a no calculator section, now you have the calculator for the entire test. The difficulty within a section increases as you go by type of question for verbal. So that means like if you get 5 of a certain question type interspersed throughout the verbal sections, those questions will get harder within that question type as you go. And then for math, it just kind of gets harder overall as you go. And then since it's an adaptive computer test, it's interesting that the test either kind of stays about the same difficulty in that second module based on your performance on the first, or if you do really well on the first module, the test becomes harder on that second module. So if you do really well in the first verbal module, the second verbal module is not going to be harder overall. And that can be a little disconcerting if you're not used to that kind of difficulty jump from practice, because now every question tends to be a little more challenging and it's going to take you longer. So just a big, this is why the test is only 2 hours, because the test can kind of figure out where you should be in scoring based on a more limited number of questions, which is nice. So format stuff, let's look at scoring. So just like today, it's out of 1600. You get a verbal score and a math score from 200 to 800. Like I said before, the PSAT, it's out of 1520, so up to 760 in each section. And then the scores are available, I think it's safe to say, about several days after the test, give or take. I don't think that that's really ironed out yet. I think they're probably working out some kinks with that. But, I think for the international students, maybe Blake knows better than me. How long did it take to get scores? Oh, I think you're mute, Blake.
They came back the same time as the paper scores. So we're not sure whether that was just because they didn't want the scores from the international students to come back earlier than the US students, or if there was some other reason, but they came back, 2 weeks later.
When in doubt, we should believe the conspiracy theory. That's what I've learned with the College Board. So it's probably that they just didn't want, no, I'm just kidding. Who knows why? It's a new test. So I think things like that may be kind of in flux. So anyway, what about super scoring? So we think so far that colleges will probably super score, and then maybe some, I don't know if anybody here has heard from any colleges about this yet. Probably not, because they haven't had to think about it, but they're probably going to super score, of course, with the digital SAT. And if you have a paper score and a digital score, they'll probably super score, because their entire point is like this test is the same as the old test in terms of what it's testing, and the scores are, interchangeable with the current test scores. So even though the test is quite a bit different, that is what they're, claiming. But anyway, so we hope super scoring will kind of be a thing, just like it is now. When you actually take the test, just to give you an idea what happens. For now, we think the national testing dates are going to remain constant. But of course, since the test is a lot more convenient to take, we don't have to have, a test mailed to the school anymore. We're probably going to have a little more flexibility around sort of school day testing, in terms of, people who can't test on a certain national testing date for some reason. Like I said before, you bring your own device, and we want to make sure that you not only show up that day with your device, but that it is fully charged. because I don't think you're allowed to. Well, you're not going to have time to charge it if it runs out of batteries. You're kind of in trouble. And that you have the Blue Book app installed on it, and you've tried the app before. You don't want it to be like day one of trying the app. So we want to make sure students have kind of practiced with the app and on the same exact device they're going to plan to take the test on, just to avoid potential issues. So when you're taking the test, you'll the nice thing about it is you can go back and forth with between questions. You can do things like annotate the test and highlight parts of it if you're in the verbal section. There's this thing called a question eliminator, so you can like cross off answer choices that you think are wrong so they don't distract you anymore.
Just
And
to
there,
chime
oh,
in on that, the feedback from the students who took the digital SAT, they really liked the score eliminator. They liked being able to skip and come back, and they liked using the highlighter. So for any of your students who are planning on taking that, that's definitely something they want to actually practice with, because the students who used it felt like it was a nice advantage during the test.
that reminds me, like for those of us who haven't taken a computer test before with reading passages on it and like math questions, it's kind of I think it's more fun to take a test like that on paper, because on paper, of course, you can like highlight more easily with your pencil. So getting used to a computer test does take a even if you're very computer savvy, like all students kind of are, it's still a little more annoying to like do things like read on a computer, I think, because it's harder to annotate. So getting used to those tools will be important as students practice. Of course, they'll be able to with the app, the College Board app. So the questions are drawn from a pool, so it's harder to cheat. The person sitting next to you will have a different version of the test. So, just one of the security measures the College Board is taking to make it a little harder to cheat, or quite a bit harder to cheat, let's say. Um, all right. What about accommodations? So we think current accommodations are just kind of the same. Obviously, the test is digital. If you have some kind of accommodation that sort of enables you to take a paper test, you still can take a paper test. So they have to provide that for you. I have heard that you cannot end a section early if you have extra time, so you just kind of have to sit there if you're done early. But just a slight disadvantage there. But other than that, hopefully, they can, provide, the same accommodations as they normally would. And I think that that's the plan. Test prep. So I'm going to turn it over to Blake here. Blake is the one who's immersed in this stuff. So Blake, you can just kind of talk through what are the important things to know about like how we're getting students ready.
So right now, we have been lucky where College Board has put out so much official material for SAT prep, since the 2016 test. 3 or 4 QASs a year, and then the 8 practice tests in the big blue book. That's going to change. We're not sure how much it's going to change, but right now there's a decent amount of material. The college has the blue book app, which is the app that you would use to take the actual digital SAT. That has 4 practice tests, and so those are adaptive. So if you do well in the first section, you can get a difficult second section in the verbal and the math, and if you don't do as well, you get an easier one. So there's actually quite a bit of practice between those 4 tests. And College Board's announced that in the summer they're going to release, I think, 3 or 4 more. At least that's what they said. Khan Academy has some free practice. It's not really arranged into practice tests, but it has practice questions for each type that you can work through. And so I've looked through it, and I would say that it's good, but it's not necessarily for someone who's trying to be a high scorer. It doesn't have a ton of practice. It doesn't have a ton of difficult practice. So it's more like an introduction, getting you used to the question types and how to approach them and how to answer them than like a nice big chunk of practice that a student who's trying to get a high score can use. The other feedback we got was that students who learned to use Desmos, they really appreciated it. So the Desmos calculator that comes, excuse me, inside the test, it can solve a lot of questions easily and potentially a lot more easily than even bringing a graphing calculator can, because of its ability to graph things quickly. And so the students who learned to use Desmos, who practiced with it before, found that to be a huge advantage. There's some kind of discussion that the math questions they ask might change because there are some massive shortcuts you can use with Desmos. But for now, there are certain questions that become trivial, just being able to like be basically proficient with it. And as far as like current SAT prep that translates to the digital test, the writing and language stuff is pretty much the same. The math stuff is pretty much the same. There does seem to be some increased focus on geometry, especially a geometry with triangles, but it's hard to say whether that's like a permanent change or just kind of a recent trend. The biggest difference is with the reading. So the current SAT reading section is pretty drastically different from the digital section. The passages that all the students hated, the historical ones that could be potentially 300 years old, those are going to be gone. And so they're not going to be reading these long passages. Like Vince said, you're going to have short passages and you're going to have questions based on that. There's still going to be vocabulary and context, so that'll carry over. But a lot of the other question types will not carry over, and then the passages that you'll be reading will be different. So that's the part where the current SAT tests won't be extremely helpful for preparation, but the writing and language section, the current one, and the current math will be. All of the math on the digital SAT will be, you can use the Desmos calculator, so there's no calc section anymore. But the types of questions that you see in the no calc section still test the same concepts. So as far as practice, they're still useful.
I think it's interesting to note too, Blake, haven't we noticed that for those students, and a lot of the students we work with are super high achievers, there are actually some pretty challenging math questions that almost everybody's gonna struggle with. So part of the deal is like, practicing some of these harder questions at the end of the sections.
Yeah, and it's some of the feedback we got too was that the students were expecting a jump, the ones who were scoring highly, they were expecting a jump in difficulty from the first, say first math to the second math section, or first verbal to the second verbal. But a lot of them were a little bit taken aback by how big that jump was. And so, what we're thinking for preparation for that is that you want to make sure that that they get a lot of practice with highly difficult questions, and so like they're used to the jump there, because one of the biggest issues there is your pacing. So with an easier section, you can be a little more leisurely. With a harder section, you might have to skip and come back. You might have to pace yourself, decide that this question isn't worth it. And for students who score highly, a lot of times they're not even used to that because they never have to make that decision. They're used to doing a section quickly enough to where they never have to decide whether to skip and come back. So that's definitely something that they'll have to adjust to. Yeah, the technical difficulties, the feedback we saw was that there were some technical difficulties, but it was more like the test started later for some students, not necessarily that a lot of students couldn't take it. The number of cancellations internationally was actually lower than during a lot of the paper administrations. So that's a fairly good sign. I was kind of expecting a little bit more. I was expecting more problems, just because the whole world switching to a digital test. I thought there'd be more technical difficulties, so they at least handled that fairly well. You're supposed to install the Blue Book app a few days before the test, make sure that everything's working. This isn't a thing that you do the morning of or once you get there. Your laptop needs to be fully charged. They're not going to have a power station for the 20 kids in the room who are going to plug in everything at the same time and take their test. A lot of the testing rooms were about the same size as an SAT paper test room, so 15 to 20 students. The difficulty jump between modules was jarring. We covered that. Using the answer eliminator to cross out answers. A lot of students really liked that. Just removing that, visually, made it a little bit easier to focus on what they wanted to learn. Alluding to some of the stuff that Vince mentioned, when you're taking a test on a screen and you can't mark stuff up, there is definitely an adjustment there. And part of it, you can't cross things out. You can't kind of think with your hand in the same way that you could on a paper test. And so the answer eliminator is definitely helpful for that. There is a highlighter. The highlighter doesn't work on the math section, but it does work on the verbal. But those are definitely things that help compensate for the fact that you are held back a little bit when you can't mark up the test. And the guessing and skipping, if you get stuck, that's a skill everyone should have. But typically, a lot of times, the students who are high scoring on the paper SAT haven't developed it because they just haven't been forced to. But when they get to a hard section, that's a skill they definitely need to work on.
Yeah, and in that hard section, from the get-go, it's hard. We're harder.
Yeah.
So it's not like, that's sometimes psychologically tough. It's like the first question I can't do. Oh my gosh. And yeah, that could happen. You just have to be comfortable moving on. And even the high scores have to get used to that. So just a new thing that we have to sort of impart to students. Great. So, Blake, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add about that you think sort of counselors need to know here, but if not, we can turn it over to questions. So, anybody have any thoughts about anything we said? I mean, obviously the content of the test might not be something you guys are focused on as much. It might just be interesting for you to hear, but anybody have any questions about that or any part of what we mentioned? You can just speak up if you have a question.
Vince, I have several questions. One is going back to the PSAT. Is it also, since it's going to be digital, is it also shorter, and is it also using the Blue Book app?
I think the number of questions on the PSAT is the same. And
as the digital, yeah,
is the digital SAT. So the numbers of questions that we talked about before, 27 questions in each verbal section, 22 in each math. Apparently that's going to be the same on the PSAT. So the total time, I would imagine, is also the same.
Yeah. The digital PSAT and digital SAT will be more or less the same. They're a little bit different right now, the paper versions of the PSAT and SAT, and they're going to become basically the same now.
So would it suffice as practice? Because, is it using the Blue Book app, and is it, good enough, sort of a marker as to how the student does on the SAT in general? I've always kind of used it as, okay, you can use that as your practice SAT and now go take a practice ACT so we can talk about it.
Yeah. It'll be an excellent, practice run for the SAT. Yeah.
And just like the current PSAT, we imagine the PSAT will be potentially a little easier than the SAT, but we just don't have any practice PSATs yet in the digital format.
What would be a reason for somebody to choose the ACT over this nice, shorter? Obviously, this is going to be very appealing. College Board, it's a good move on their part, get their revenues up. But what would an argument be for somebody to take the ACT anyway?
Well, we've got the ACT has really remained unchanged for like 30 years. So they kind of have that track record of consistency. When a new test emerges like the SAT did in 2016, sometimes there's some bugs where, certain question types seem to be a thing and then they fade away and we're like, oh, we didn't have to care about that after all. So there's more, prep material for sure for the ACT because we have, like dozens and dozens of old official tests. So that's one thing. People sometimes prefer taking a test on paper. That's another thing. Sometimes people just like the test better or are better at it. So these are, just the first things off the top of my head that I think of when, like, why would we even take the ACT? What about you, Blake? What do you think?
You covered most of them. I would say the biggest difference is, half of your SAT score comes from math and a quarter of your ACT score comes from math. And that other quarter is, comes from the science section. So what I usually do is, the things that Vince mentioned are relevant. So I go through those with the student, but then also just see how they do on science compared to math. And if the science score is, better than their equivalent math score, then the ACT would be better. And if it's not, then the SAT would be better.
I also think just having looked at some of the material for the SAT, the digital SAT verbal, it's a little trickier in terms of the kinds of questions because there's a little more critical reasoning involved. Whereas the ACT reading is very fast paced, but it's also very straightforward. You don't really have to think a whole heck of a lot. It's more like locating information and remembering information. So in the ACT and the SAT, grammar is virtually identical. So for somebody who is tries the digital SAT and is like confused by some of those reasoning questions, some students might find those questions off-putting, and have a slightly harder time getting used to them. So that could be something that we'll look at too as we have students try the tests. But it's hard to that yeah, as you said, and that 2 hour that 2 hour timing, it goes a long way.
Yeah, the ACT is going to be a hard sell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I don't want to take any test, but if I have to take one, which one am I going to pick?
Mm-hmm.
The 2 hour one, not the 4 hour one. Thank God no essay anymore. So no option for an SAT essay, and of course nobody cares about the ACT essay anyway.
Yeah, I think there's like 2 schools in the country. That's why it still exists. It's like was it the Air Force or Naval Academy? One of those.
Or Coast Guard, or West Point. I forget.
I think it's West Point. I think it's West Point.
West Point. Yeah.
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 Yep.
Did you have any other questions, Anne? Was that it, or?
That's it, unless somebody else says something that triggers something else in my mind.
Have any families that you guys have worked with mentioned the new SAT yet at all? Has it been on their radar? Yeah,
No, they've all heard it first from me.
Yeah, that's not surprising.
It seems like, once everyone's taken the digital PSAT, and then seeing like, oh, it's not that scary, or it wasn't really a disaster, then I think SAT is going to have a really strong marketing advantage, being 2/3 as long as the ACT. So I think it like a lot of people don't know about the digital SAT yet, but after the digital PSAT they will, and they'll probably want to see like, okay, well, is it buggy? Are there a lot of problems? Whatever. And if they feel assured that that's the case, then I feel like SAT is going to definitely benefit from being shorter.
I hope that they react to the surge in potential popularity by opening more test centers, because I can now see the fact that, nobody's going to be able to register for an SAT. It's already bad.
Yeah. It seems like ACT and College Board are just, they just can't get the schools to really care that much. I think they're trying. I don't know how well they're doing trying, but it seems like it's not on their end that there's some apathy in the schools, especially after test optional. And you probably see this too, right? Like sites get canceled a lot too, especially on the school day tests. It's bad. You got to always be ready. Like you're going to get a call or a text from one of your students, like, a week ahead or whatever, saying, my test got canceled. There's nothing in 300 miles. And then you got to figure out what to do.
Have they ever thought about using like they do for licensing people in all places like Sylvan and all that are proctored? Especially now that it's digital.
I haven't heard of that. I have heard of them. I mean, I know they have used stuff like hotel conference rooms. They've done stuff like that. but I haven't heard of any of them using like a tutoring center.
Yeah, I had kids going all the way to Yuma to try to take it last season, so
Yeah.
it's a problem without a doubt. I'm glad you're mentioning that they should try the ACT as well, because some students do spike on it, and if that's your better score, it's worth the extra hour.
Yeah. What I usually tell students ahead of time is like, I can say what's probably better for you based on a bunch of details, but like if I'm 80% right, then I'm 20% wrong. And I don't, like you want to see, let's actually just find out. It does cost some time, like you said, but it's better to know for sure than to just go off averages.
Yeah,
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Anybody else have any thoughts, comments about this situation? I think we're well ahead of the game, hopefully here, in terms of getting ready for it. But yeah, never hurts to be ready early.
And bottom line, not a ton of difference in the prep, is what you're saying, content wise.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some significant differences, but like the core things it's testing are mostly the same. So
Yeah. You want to get used to the format, right? But the content's the same pretty much in English and math. The content will change for the reading. And they're basically the official stuff is the only reading practice that's good. The Khan Academy and the College Board release stuff. I've looked at some of the other materials that were put out kind of quickly, and they just didn't have a good enough sense of what the material, what the questions were going to be, and the passages that you were going to see. So that I'd say that's still the place where there's not a lot of great practice yet, but hopefully that'll be remedied.
Beautiful. Gosh, guys, thank you very, very much for this info. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
yeah, you're welcome. Cool. Well, I'll let everybody go here unless anybody has anything else. Thank you again for taking the time, and we'll get this recording out to you just so you have it if you want to share it with anybody, and I'll send you the slides as well. If you're not connected to us on LinkedIn, I think most of you are, but Vince Kotchian on LinkedIn or Blake Jensen, you want to connect with us there. And then obviously, if you think of any other questions down the road, we're very happy to help. So, all right, well, have a good weekend, everybody, and see you guys again next time we do this for the next new test that comes out.